Hello, and welcome to the second lesson from our series taken from the book of Judges. If you remember, in our first lesson, we established that the book of Judges covers the history of the nation of Israel from the time of Joshua's death up until the time of Samuel's birth, and of course, through Samuel, the establishment of the monarchy. The children of Israel have been delivered from Egypt. Moses has led them through the wilderness and now has brought them to the Jordan River. Joshua has led them across the Jordan River, and they have scattered throughout the promised land, throughout the area that we call Palestine, each of the tribes living in their individual areas as assigned to them by lot. And then Joshua dies, and the people of Israel have no king. And the scripture we see over and over again, Israel had no king and they did as they pleased. In that first lesson from chapter 2, we describe the cycle that seems to have occurred over and over and over again during these 340 plus or minus years. And that cycle goes like this. The people become friends with their neighbors. They start worshiping their neighbors' gods. They intermarry with the neighbors. They start sacrificing to their neighbors' gods. Then Yahweh turns them over to their neighbors. That is, when the neighbors oppress them, Yahweh does not intervene on their behalf. And they live under oppression for years. They cry out, and God then raises up a leader to come and deliver them from that oppression. And these leaders we call judges. Okay? They are delivered from oppression. They serve God as long as that judge is alive. When that judge dies, then they go back to their old ways, once again becoming friends with their neighbors, worshiping their neighbors' gods, then suffering oppression, crying out to God, and God raising up another judge, another leader. We are told there in chapter 2 that because of their disobedience, God had chosen not to run these tribes completely out, but he was going to leave them there so that they might be a test of Israel's obedience. Now, in chapter 3, Samuel, who tradition tells us was the author of this book, Samuel tells us about three particular judges. He tells us about Othniel. Othniel was the judge that was raised up when Israel started worshiping the Baals, and they were captured and oppressed by the king of Aram. They were oppressed for 8 years. God raised up Othniel, who defeated Aram, and there is peace for 40 years, as long as Othniel was alive. When he died, then they resorted back to the worshiping of other gods. God then raised up a judge by the name of Ehud. Now, Israel at this time was being oppressed by Eglon, who was the king of Moab. And they lived under Eglon's oppression for 18 years. People cried out. God responds to their cry and raises up Ehud. Ehud actually gets an audience with the king, Eglon, and assassinates him. And then the army is able to defend itself and free the people. And there is a time of 80 years of peace following the assassination of Eglon. But then, of course, when Ehud dies, they once again resort back to their old ways. The judge Shamgar is simply mentioned in chapter 3. He is one of those minor judges who is just mentioned, and we're told that his role was to deliver the people from the oppression of the Philistines. This brings us then to chapter 4. In the first few verses of chapter 4, we're told that Ehud had died, and in fact the people had returned to their evil ways. We are told that Yahweh has sold them, or has delivered them, or has allowed them to be conquered by a king named Jabin. Jabin was the king who lived in Hazor. Now, Jabin had a very strong army. In fact, we're told in the scripture that he has 900 chariots with iron wheels. And what the commentators tell us means that is that these chariots would have an iron rim, so that the wooden wheel wouldn't break in the middle of battle. It's not that the whole chariot was made out of iron, but more likely it was a wooden chariot, but it had iron on its wheels to make it stronger, more durable during battle. Israel had no chariots. Okay, the King Jabin has in fact oppressed the Israelite tribes now for 20 years, and the people cry out for help. And the story of Barak and Deborah is the lesson that we'll be looking at today, taken from chapter 4. But before we get into that deliverance, let's talk about a couple of things as a way of background. First of all, the city Hazor. Hazor is located 9 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. So this would be in the area that in New Testament days we would call Galilee. That particular area was inhabited by the tribe of Naphtali. Now remember, when Joshua brought the tribes over, he allocated areas to tribes. So a tribe would go in and occupy an area, and another tribe would go to a different area. This is in the very northern area, and it was a tribe of Naphtali that lived here. The city of Hazor has been explored by archaeologists because this is a city that was very strong. It then was destroyed. It was rebuilt. It was destroyed. It is a place of great interest to archaeologists, and they've done quite a bit of excavating at that site, and we've learned somewhat about that city. At one point in time, it was the largest city in Canaan. It's located on some very important trade routes. There was a trade route going north to Damascus, which would be up into Syria. And then it was also located on a trade route that was going east and west. That is, going from the Euphrates River in the east to the west, all the way over to the Mediterranean coast. As I said, important city, large city, destroyed many times, but always rebuilt. Now, in the book of Joshua, we're told that after Joshua had crossed over the Jordan River, taken Jericho, he then went south, conquered the area south of Jericho, which would be down on the east side of the Dead Sea. Then he turned and went north and up along the west coast of the Dead Sea. Then he goes north on the west side of the Jordan River and the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and even further north from the Sea of Galilee. We're told that in Joshua chapter 11, we're told that when he marched north, he marched as far north as Hazor. In chapter 11, we read, "At that time Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, and he burned Hazor itself." Okay? So we've got Joshua going as far north and destroying the city of Hazor. Now, interesting enough, the king that Joshua defeated at that time was named Jabin. Now we're told, 175 years later, that a king named Jabin is living in Hazor. Now, what we've come to understand is, obviously, Hazor has been rebuilt. It's been 175 years since Joshua had originally destroyed it. It has been rebuilt. And it seems that the name Jabin had become the name of a dynasty of kings. So this is not the same man that Joshua was killed 175 years before that's now back on the throne causing trouble for the Israelites, but rather this is one of his descendants in the same dynasty, but the king's name is Jabin. With that background now, let's begin in chapter 4 of Judges, and let's look down in verse 4. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. Let's stop right there. Now, in those first 3 verses of that chapter, we indicated that we are told that after Ehud had died, the people had gone back to their evil ways, and that Jabin was the king of that whole area. It seems like maybe the other tribes were all listening to that king. He was reigning in Hazor, and he was oppressing the whole, all of the tribes of Israel. Now, we're also told in those first couple of verses that the commander of his army was a man by the name of Sisera. Okay, and listen to what Samuel tells us in verse 3. Because he, Sisera, had 900 iron chariots and cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. It is then that Samuel tells us of the role of Deborah. Now, we're told that Deborah was a prophetess. That is, she was one who was inspired by God to deliver the message of God. She was the one that was carrying the message to God's people. Now, it's not that she is not unique as a prophetess in the Old Testament. There are 4 other women in the Old Testament who are recognized and called prophetess. Miriam, Moses' sister, being one of them. As a prophetess, as one who heard from God and delivered God's message, she was a leader in Israel. People looked to her because they knew she was speaking for God. Now, we're told here in this verse that she held court. Now, in our first lesson, we indicated that the judges did not play a judicial role. Deborah is the exception. She's technically not going to be the judge. She is simply the prophetess that's going to inspire this story. However, she is fulfilling a judicial role as a prophetess. Many times in the Old Testament, the prophets were the one that people brought their disputes to have resolved, because people felt like they would have God's will done if the prophetess or the prophet was the one that helped them resolve their disputes. So she is holding court at a place called the Palm of Deborah in Ephraim. Now, Ephraim is located just north of the Dead Sea. We're south of the Sea of Galilee. We're talking about an area that is rather mountainous. Palm trees did not normally grow in that area. So this was a rare sight to have a palm tree there. She lived there, and people would bring their disputes to her to be resolved. Now, some debate is encountered in the commentaries. Some debate is held in the commentaries about whether her living in Ephraim made her a member of the tribe of Ephraim. Later on in chapter 5, verse 15, she is described as the princess of Issachar. Issachar is the name of another tribe living in another location. So whether she was of the tribe of Issachar, who happened to be living in Ephraim at this time, or was actually a member of the tribe of Ephraim, we don't know, but it doesn't really matter. She's there. She is recognized by Israel as a prophetess. People are bringing their disputes to her, and we are down south of the Sea of Galilee considerably. Just barely north of the Dead Sea is where she is holding court, if you will. She held court under the Palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. Okay? This we know about her. We know that she's married to a man by the name of Lapidoth. We know nothing else about him. We know he is Deborah's husband, and that's it. There's no other reference to him other than being her husband. Now, Ramah, we're told that she's holding court at that palm tree, and that it was between Ramah and Bethel. Ramah was 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Bethel was 15 miles north of Jerusalem. So she is somewhere more than 5 miles, but less than 15 miles north of Jerusalem, holding court. In verse 6, we see how she is used of God. She sent for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor." Okay? Now here she is, and geographically now, we're talking about covering that whole area of Palestine, the Promised Land. She's down just north of Jerusalem. Barak lives in Kedesh. Now, Kedesh was a city in the area occupied by the tribe of Naphtali. Now remember, we said that Hazor was in the area occupied by the city of Naphtali, far north of the Sea of Galilee. Okay? So she sends for Barak, who is a known leader in Israel. Now the Israelites are suffering under Jabin, under the king from Hazor. They're suffering because of their backslidden condition. They're worshiping the other gods. And now here's the prophetess, and she sends up and gets Barak, and it seems that he comes down to where she is, and she gives him this message. And the message she gives him is that he is to raise an army of 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. Zebulun was an area immediately adjacent to Naphtali, but just to the south. So this is in that northern area. She says, get 10,000 troops from these two tribes. Why the other tribes are involved, we don't know. This isn't God's plan. But God's prophetess says, raise a army of 10,000 men from Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, during this time period, the coastal area along the Mediterranean Sea, all up and down the Mediterranean Sea, from down the Mediterranean Sea directly west of Jerusalem, all the way up to where we are with Naphtali in the north. The coastal area is ruled by Canaanites, the Canaanite neighbors, the Canaanite tribes, several different tribes. They all worship different gods. But these are the neighbors that are causing problems, and specifically this one neighbor the king of whom lives in Hazor, and they're oppressing the children of Israel. The king Jabin, like I said, is thought to be the one that all these other Canaanite tribes are looking to for leadership. And so God's plan is to raise 10,000 soldiers from these two tribes. Then look what Deborah tells them is God's plan. She says, and lead the army to the Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, this is the commander of the army that supports King Jabin there in Hazor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops, to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. So she says, this is God's message. You are to take your troops and go to Mount Tabor. And don't worry, God is going to take care of things. God is going to lure, he's going to lead by circumstances. He will bring Sisera with that army, that powerful army, and those 900 chariots. He'll bring them down to the Kishon River. Now, Mount Tabor is a mountain that's about 1,400 feet above sea level. It's located 11 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee. Now, let's get our geography perspective. Naphtali is north of the Sea of Galilee. Mount Tabor is down to the southwest of the Sea of Galilee. So the instructions are to get your army and march south and come down to Mount Tabor. Now, Mount Tabor is on the north side of a valley that has a famous name, and it's called the Valley of Jezreel. the Valley of Jezreel. The Valley of Jezreel runs from the Mediterranean coast all the way into the Jordan River. And it is a valley area between these mountains. On the west side at the Mediterranean is Mount Carmel. And we know of Mount Carmel from the prophet Elijah's days. Mount Tabor is over on to the east, on the east side. Now this river, this Kishon River, runs from the mountains there along the Jordan River, down through this valley, going west, and eventually empties into the Mediterranean Sea there at Mount Carmel. Now, in the dry times, this river is dried up, and it's just a valley, a flatland. When there rains in the mountains down along the Jordan River, north of the Sea of Galilee, when there's rain there, that river can become flooded and can become a very, very powerful river. Okay? So God's plan was he is going to bring Sisera's army from Hazor, way up there in the north too, in Naphtali, bring them down into the valley of Jezreel along the Kishon River. And the promise is, I will give the army over to you. I will give the army over to you. This is Deborah, the prophetess, message to Barak, the leader, the Israeli leader. Now, why Barak? Barak is one, evidently, who was recognized by the Israelites, especially those in the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. So when he called for an army, men responded to go with him. But look at Barak's answer to Deborah. Now, here's the question. Here's the challenge. I want you to take your army, raise an army, take that army, march south down to Mount Tabor to fight Sisera's army with all those chariots, a very fierce army, a very cruel people. I want you to come down there and fight them. And in the human sense of thing, the army of Israel didn't have a chance. Number one, they didn't have any chariots. They lived in the hill country. Chariots are only good in flatland. They didn't have a chance, especially to come down and fight in the flatland. So what does Barak say? Verse 8. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go with you. I will go. But if you don't go with me, I will not go. God has raised up a leader, Barak, but he is a reluctant leader. And he says to Deborah, if you'll go, I'll go. But if you won't go, I won't go. He seems to be saying, I have more confidence in your relationship with God than I have in my own relationship with God. In other words, if I'm going to go out there, I want God to go with us. And to make sure God's going with us, I want you, the prophetess of God, to go with us as well. Maybe we could read into this as being a lack of faith on his own part, not to accept what God has instructed him through God's prophet. We have those doubts about Barak. But listen to the way the writer of the Hebrews refers to him. In Hebrews chapter 11, and that Faith Hall of Fame, chapter 11, verses 32 and 33. And what more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. That seems to be listing him amongst those who have faith. So let's not be too hard on Barak, because he does end up going, because Deborah goes with him. But he's reluctant, but he is willing to go. And he's willing to go if Deborah will go with him. One writer put it this way. It says, don't be too hard on Barak. Barak and all who went with him showed real courage and trust in God to go out against Sisera and his army. They had essentially no weapons to fight against a technologically advanced army having 900 chariots of iron. In addition, God led them to fight on a plain, which would have given a great advantage to the force with chariots. So the fact that he went, we need to recognize he did take his army and go. And he's going out to fight under the most unlikely of circumstances. He, with his ill-equipped, ill-prepared group of mountain men, are going out to fight in the valley, on the flatland, a fierce army that has captured this whole area of the world, especially an army with 900 chariots. So there was some faith on the part of Barak. It may not have been a ringing endorsement, but he does say, if you go, I will go. I won't go if you don't go, but if you go, I will go. Deborah's response, well, okay, I'll go with you, but you need to understand something. You will not be given the credit for defeating Sisera's army. Very well, Deborah said, I will go with you. But because of the way you are going about this, the honor will not be yours. Defeating Sisera, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman. Now, in all likelihood, Barak read that to mean that she was talking about herself. In other words, when history's written, where everybody's going to know that you wouldn't go without Deborah, and when Sisera's defeated, it's going to be Deborah that gets the praise. Now we're going to find out that's not what really happens, but that's probably what he is thinking at the time. So she says, I'll go with you, but you need to understand that in fact, the honor of defeating Sisera will not be given to you, but will be given to a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. So she goes with him back north, back up into the tribal area of Naphtali, and he raises his 10,000 troops who followed him. Again, now Barak must have been a leader for these men to be willing to follow him. And of course, Deborah being a prophetess, they would recognize that. So they follow him and fulfill the instructions that God has given them. Now, down in verse 11, we're setting the stage for what's going to happen. Now, Heber, the Kenite, had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and had pitched his tent by the great tree in Zanaim near Kadesh. Okay, Heber the Kenite. The Kenites were a tribe, a sub-tribe of the Midianites. Now, remember that Moses, when he left Egypt for that 40 years and went out into the wilderness, he lived with some Midianites. And remember, we learned that the Midianites were descendants of Abraham by a later wife, not descendants of Sarah, but was descendants of Abraham's later wife. So they were descendants of Abraham. Now the Kenites were a sub-tribe of the Midianites, if you will. Now Samuel identifies them as being relatives because they were descendants of Moses' brother-in-law. Well, they were descendants of Moses' brother-in-law because they were also descendants of Moses' father-in-law. So when we studied that chapter on Moses going to live with the Midianites, and we said that Jethro was a descendant of Abraham. Jethro's son would be a descendant of Abraham. And so these are the Kenites. These are Kenites. These are people who are descendants of Jethro and Moses' brother-in-law. The Kenites were nomads. They wandered all over this area. They raised sheep. They tried to maintain peace with the Canaanite tribes. They tried to maintain peace with Israel. As we would say in today's vernacular, they made nice with whomever they lived next to. They tried to maintain friends with all of them. They raised sheep. They were also known as metal worker and bronze workers. They moved north to south. This particular man, this particular Kenite by the name of Heber, he has now left the other Kenites, and he has moved from the southern part of Israel, or the Palestine, to the north, up to near Kadesh, which again is in Naphtali. It is thought that maybe it is this Heber who has told Jabin, the king at Hazor, about Barak raising the 10,000 troops from Zebulun and Naphtali. That would be something that a Kenite would do, that is, making friends with the Israelite king. They seem to be the most powerful in the area. They're the ones you want to keep happy. So it seems that maybe he was the one, because remember, Deborah goes with Barak back to Kadesh, and from there he raises his army. Heber has moved up to that area, and very possibly is the one who has told King Jabin and Hazor that in fact there is this army being raised. Well, we're told then that when they told Sisera, I'm looking at verse 12, that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera gathered his 900 iron chariots and all the men with him from Hazeroth Hagoyim to the Kishon River. So what happens is, he's raised his army. He's marched south down to Mount Tabor. He didn't march toward Hazor. He didn't go to attack the king in his palace. He marched south down to Mount Tabor. Sisera finds out about it. Now, what was God's promise to Barak? That he would lure Sisera down to the river. So, we don't know what means, don't know what method, except that Sisera, hearing that there has been an army raised that's gone south to Mount Tabor, decides he needs to go down and take care of this army once and for all. So he brings his men and his chariots, and they move south down toward where Mount Tabor, where the army of Barak is located. And when they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera gathered the 900 chariots and all the men, and they would go to the Kishon River. They go to the river that's in the valley. Okay? Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Now, get the picture. Sisera and his army are down in the valley. They're on the flatland with all these chariots. Barak and his 10,000 men are up on Mount Tabor. And now Deborah comes and says, today's the day you need to go down to that valley and fight them down there. Wait a minute. They've got chariots. That's flat land. Let them come up here and fight us. No, you're told to go down there and fight them. This was the instruction. And Deborah tells him, God has given them into your hands. He's already given you the victory. Go down and attack them. So Barak went down Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. This is why I say we got to talk about his faith. This is why I say we got to talk about him in more honorable terms. Because he does. He goes down, marched right into what looks like the jaws of defeat. I mean, it looks like there's no way in his humanness he's going to be able to beat this army with all their chariots down on flat land. At Barak's advances, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. Now, all we're told right here is Barak brings his 10,000 men down, they attack, and God gives them into Barak's hands. A miraculous defeat of all of these chariots. A miraculous defeat. Everyone is killed. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Hazeroth Hagoyim. All the troops of Sisera fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Now that is a miraculous victory. That is a miracle brought by God. Now, when we look over in chapter 5 of Judges, we have a song that Deborah sings in telling of the victory that God has given to them. And in that song, in verse 4, Deborah said, when you, Lord, when you, Yahweh, went out from Seir, when you marched down from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. Commentators believe that she is making reference to the fact that when Sisera got down there in the valley along the river with all of his chariots, there came a sudden rainstorm and the river flooded, and suddenly those chariots were a liability because they were getting stuck in the mud and the soldiers weren't able to fight. And Barak's men were able to go in and put every one of them to the sword. In chapter 5, verse 20, still in Deborah's song, she said, "From the heavens the star fought." The stars fought. This is a divine intervention. This has come from God. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away. The age-old river, the river Kishon. March on, my soul, be strong. God used the river and the rain and destroyed the army of Sisera. Every one of them was killed. Sisera, however, down verse 17, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because they were in friendly relations between Jabin and the king of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Sisera got out of his chariot and he fled. He is the one man who got away. And he flees back north, going back toward the tribe of Naphtali. And he gets up there and he comes to the camp of Heber. Now, probably he knows that Heber is friendly with King Jabin. I mean, especially if Heber is the one who had brought the message that Barak's army had been gathered at Kadesh. Bottom line is, he sees this as a friendly camp. He sees this as a place where he might be safe. And so he decides to escape there. One commentator writes it this way: when Sisera learned of the military muster of the Israelites at Mount Tabor, he deployed his forces at the river Kishon, where he no doubt supposed that his force of 900 chariots of iron would be more than a match for Barak's troops. However, there was a very heavy, untimely rain that made a roaring river out of the Kishon and flooded the plains at the foot of Mount Tabor. Simultaneously, Barak with his 10,000 men rushed down the steep slopes of Tabor and cut to pieces Sisera's entire force. The chariots of iron were not merely useless, bogged down in the mud, but the charioteers, trapped in their mired vehicles, were easy prey for Barak's men. Sisera himself, seeing that the engagement was a total disaster, left his chariot and fled away on foot. This astounding debacle that broke the back of the Canaanite power could have been nothing other than divine intervention upon behalf of the chosen people. It was God who planned and precipitated the engagement, and it was God who ultimately sent rain. It was God's foreknowledge that the rain and the very time when it occurred that lay behind this remarkable victory. And now Sisera's on the run, and he runs to a friendly camp. He runs to Heber's camp. Now, it's interesting that he goes there feeling safe, but he goes to the tent of Jael. Now, we're told that the wife would have a separate tent from the husband. And in that day and time, a man, not her husband, would have no business going into the woman's tent. So he goes to Jael's tent, feeling especially safe that nobody will come looking for him there. Men just didn't go in women's tents. And this is Heber, the friendly Kenite. So he feels safe. He goes to Jael's tent, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because they were friendly. Jael went out to meet Sisera, and he said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she put a covering over him. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. If someone comes by and asks, is anyone here? Say no. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove a peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Wow. She befriends him. She says, come right on in. She says, you must be tired. You've been running. Come in, lay down. She covers him up. She provides for him the comforts so that he can feel safe and secure. She provides for him hospitality. He says, I'm thirsty. Give me some water. She doesn't give him water. She gives him a delicacy, milk. Now, it's probably goat's milk. Some suggest that it probably was buttermilk because of lack of refrigeration, but that would be considered to be a delicacy. So she's treating him very, with great hospitality. Come in, lay down, relax. Let me get you something to drink. And then he says, well, protect me. If anybody comes by, if you stand at the door, if anybody comes by, they're not going to want to look in here because they understand a man would not come in here. And tell them, you haven't seen me. She says, you just lay down and go to sleep. I'll take care of things. So he lays down and he's fast asleep. And then she does something, and the optics here are very graphic. She takes a tent peg and a hammer, and while he's laying there on the ground asleep, she takes the tent peg and puts it to his temple and drives it through his head, and it says into the ground. Now, I know some of us say, now, wait a minute. Now, a woman wouldn't do this. Well, you got to remember, it was the woman's lot in that day and time as nomads. It was her responsibility to take down and set up the tent every time they moved. So she was very capable of setting up a tent. She knew all about tent pegs. She knew where they were. She knew about the hammer. She knew that you used a hammer to drive. In fact, she used a hammer on a regular basis to drive the tent pegs into the ground. She would have had some strength having done that many times. So this was not anything out of the ordinary for her as far as a tent peg and a hammer. Now, driving it through someone's head is unusual. But this is what she did. This was, while he was resting safe and secure, she was being used to, in effect, destroy this leader of the army of Jabin. This will be then the deliverance of the people of Israel from the oppression. It says, Barak came in pursuit of Jezreel, and Jael went out to meet him. Come, she said, I will show you the man you're looking for. So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, the Canaanite king, before the Israelites. And the land of the Israelites grew stronger and stronger against Jabin and the Canaanite king until they destroyed him. So Barak was able then to lead the army and destroy Jabin and the Canaanites at that point in time. Now, some would suggest that she was acting very treacherously. One writer says, in the ancient world, you would think her a treacherous woman. She broke her promise to Sisera and killed him. She killed a man that her own husband had made peace with. But she was doing that motivated, obviously, by God's plan. When Barak came looking for him, he found him dead. And Deborah's song over chapter 5 says this, most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women. She was God's instrument. And God's prophecy through Deborah was fulfilled. The honor of defeating Sisera would not go to a man. It would go to Deborah. Okay, what do we learn from all this? Well, first of all, we can see how God is using several different people in several different roles to accomplish his will. The Israelites have forsaken him. They're worshiping these other gods. They've cried out. out of grace and mercy, he responds. And to accomplish his will of delivering them, this time he's using several people. Barak had a role to play. Barak was a leader. It took someone of Barak's leadership skills and his visibility to raise an army of 10,000. But he wasn't the only means of accomplishing God's will. There was Deborah, the prophetess. She too was recognized, but she was the one that was delivering the message. She was the one that was instructing Barak to raise the army and then to go out and fight Sisera even on the plains. She had a role. The role she played, Barak couldn't play. The role Barak played, Deborah couldn't play. And then Jael had a role that neither one of them could have played. So you see, God's using different people with different skills and different circumstances to accomplish his role, his will, his mission. Each of them had a distinctive role to play, and it took all of them for God's will to be accomplished. God needs lots of different roles to be played. For God's will to be accomplished, each of us has a role, and he needs for each of us to fulfill that calling he's placed on us. The second lesson I think we can learn from this is God uses some very unusual people to accomplish his will. Okay, we'd say, well, a prophetess. A prophet, yes, but a prophetess. In that day and time, a prophetess, like I said, she wasn't unique. There are other prophets in the Old Testament, but not that many. A role of a woman as a leader, not common in that day and that culture. An unlikely person to be raised up as a role as a leader. Barak, well, we might say we could expect him to be, as a male and as a leader of Israel, expect him to be used. But Jael, number one, she was a woman. Number two, she wasn't an Israelite. She was a Kenite. She was from a family that was a friend of Jabin, the enemy. Very, very unlikely person to be used by God. But God uses even the most unlikely of us to accomplish his will. We might say, well, I don't have those skills and graces that so-and-so has, so therefore God couldn't use me. He can use the most unlikely of us to accomplish his will. He not only can, he does. He calls us to surrender what we have, where we are, and the circumstances we are in, so that together, as a community, we can accomplish God's will right here on earth, even as it is in heaven. The lesson here is a call for us to be faithful, to be used by God to accomplish his will. God's grace is demonstrated by his again and again reaching down and providing for the people of Israel. And God's mercy, through God's mercy, he raises up individuals. And he today is raising up us individually to work collectively to accomplish his will in this pagan world we live in. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the promise that as you have called us, you will equip us and enable us. And we stop right now and acknowledge that you have, in fact, called each of us individually, but to work collectively in putting our many skills, graces together. Father, we ask that you would work in and through us this week, that your will would be accomplished. Our prayer is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, even this week, as it is in heaven. For it's in the name of the one who calls us Jesus the Christ that we pray. Amen. Thank you.